So the year was 1620. James VI of Scotland and First of England was on the throne, and Francis Bacon was Lord Chancellor of England. Only a couple of years before, Copernicus was placed on the Catholic Forbidden Index. Galileo was ordered to abandon his belief that planets revolved around the sun. And English adventurer and explorer Sir Walter Raleigh was beheaded for treason. Witch hunts began in Scotland, and in summer of that year, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth with 102 passengers bound for the New World. Shortly afterwards, the plays of William Shakespeare were gathered into one volume for the first time, and in a chillingly close parallel to modern times, 40,000 people died of plague in London. Many of you will know that the School of Divinity is set to celebrate something of a milestone in 2021. It's the 175th anniversary of the laying of the foundation of the new college building by Thomas Chalmers in 1846. And the more observant of you will have seen the date across the archway, 1846. But we shouldn't forget that divinity has been taught at Edinburgh since the founding of the university in 1583. And the oldest chair in the university, the chair of divinity, was founded 400 years ago in 1620. It seemed to me that this was something worth celebrating. And who better to talk about the chair than its present incumbent, Professor David Fergusson. Now, David is well known to many of us here, but for those who are new to the community, I'll say a few words of introduction. David studied philosophy and theology at the universities of Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Oxford, and worked for several years as a parish minister in the Church of Scotland. Having held the chair of systematic theology in the University of Aberdeen, he returned to Edinburgh as Professor of Divinity in 2000. He served as principal of New College for a decade, and from 2009 to 11, he was a vice principal of the university. In 2016, he was awarded the Order of the British Empire, the OBE, for services to arts, education, and the Church of Scotland. And in July 2019, the Queen appointed him Dean of the Chapel Royal in Scotland and Dean of the Order of the Thistle. David has delivered the Bampton Lectures in Oxford, the Gifford Lectures in Glasgow, the Warfield Lectures in Princeton, the Burke's Lecture in Montreal, and standalone lectures throughout the world. He's a fellow of both the Royal Society of Edinburgh and the British Academy. Recent publications include a monograph on the theology of providence with Cambridge University Press and a co-edited 3-volume history of Scottish theology with Oxford University Press just last year. When he's not thinking theological thoughts, he's a keen sportsman, cyclist, and heart supporter. But today he's going to turn his attention to the chair of divinity at 400, asking, what is the future for the university's oldest chair? So, Professor Fergusson.
Head of school, colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that generous introduction. I'm grateful to Professor Bond for her invitation to deliver this opening lecture this afternoon, and I salute her determination to keep the show on the road in these days of disruption. We're indebted to her for her leadership through this difficult time, and she constantly reminds me of the virtues of practical wisdom and cheerfulness. These pre-sessional occasions have always struck me as requiring brevity, accessibility, and an admixture of the frivolous and the serious. I'll try to fulfill all of these criteria this afternoon, especially brevity. As you've heard, I've held the chair of Divinity for exactly 20 years now, and I'm grateful for this opportunity to speak about its past, its present, and its future. I have to add, however, that as an indeterminist, I'm reluctant to speculate on the future. A year ago, we couldn't possibly have guessed what was about to hit us, so describing the future is always a precarious task. I suppose that I could speculate this afternoon about whether there will be one church united under a female pope in the 22nd century, or whether we shall be baptizing extraterrestrial visitors in the 23rd century, or which of the world's religions will be the preference of our highly intelligent silicon brains uploaded onto machines in the 24th century. But that seems a frivolous exercise. In any case, the more immediate futures of theology are already emerging in the research programs and trajectories of my younger colleagues. Look at what they're doing if you want to see what theology will look like in the immediate future. What I want to do instead is to ask why the Divinity Chair should have a future at all, considering some of the threats to theology today. But in the first half of my talk, I'll give you a flavour of what a few of my predecessors were up to. As you've heard, the chair was established in 1620, making it the first and the oldest chair in the university. The inaugural principal of Edinburgh University in 1583 was Robert Rollock, and he was charged with the teaching of theology. At its foundation, our university initially ran as a small seminary for the education of clergy. And as we've heard from Professor Bond, it's worth reminding ourselves that the teaching of theology was integral to the institution from the very outset, as was the close relationship between the town, the university, and the kirk. In 1620, Patrick Sands, a lawyer rather than a theologian, was appointed to the post of principal. So the need arose for a further teaching post in the university. The chair of Divinity was therefore founded in that year, and it was occupied by Andrew Ramsay. It was soon followed by chairs in Hebrew and Semitic languages in 1642, and then ecclesiastical history in 1694, all three chairs founded in the 17th century. Biblical criticism was a latecomer, not established until 1846. Presumably it was thought that the study of the New Testament didn't require the same degree of expertise. New College may feel very old to you. It certainly has a venerable appearance which is eulogized on a daily basis by the Harry Potter tour guides. I can even recall a school open day in which an ambassador from the accommodation services once promised the incoming students a state-of-the-art hall of residence, unlike, she said, this great medieval building. But next year we will celebrate only 175 years on the mound, comparatively short time for an educational institution. And I imagine that in 2033, if my arithmetic is correct, we'll be marking 450 years of Edinburgh University and of the teaching of theology from its foundation. By that time in 2033, we'll have a vaccine, and the books may even have returned to the New College Library. If I'm still around, you can use me as a relic in the exhibition. Some significant figures in Scottish church history have occupied the chair of Divinity. I am incumbent number 24. I won't speak about the other 23, but here are a few samples. David Dickson held the post during the covenanting struggles of the 17th century. He was a great exponent of federal theology, and his career was perhaps the most politically explosive of any holder of the chair, and he would have made a wonderful impact case study. He was a great revivalist preacher in Ayrshire and went into exile in 1622 for his opposition to the imposition of the Articles of Perth by James VI. Some years later, he organised the infamous prayer book riots here in Edinburgh. He supported the raising of conventicles, extraordinary and illegal gatherings of worship. And following the restoration of Charles II, he refused the oath of supremacy and was removed from his chair in 1662, dying some months later. Dixon deserves to be better known. At the close of the 17th century, the most lamentable episode in the history of the Edinburgh Faculty of Divinity occurred with the execution of one of its students for blasphemy. Thomas Aikenhead was tried for expressing views that appeared to call into question the authority of Scripture, the Trinity, and the divinity of Christ. He was found guilty by city magistrates and hanged on the road to Leith one winter's day in 1697. Aged 18, Aikenhead offered an act of repentance, but no mercy was shown. Though this was an act of the town rather than the university, his divinity teachers, together with other ministers of the kirk, appeared to do nothing to protect him. The Aikenhead episode aroused widespread revulsion and contributed to reaction against the violence perpetrated in the name of religion during the 17th century. He was the last person to be executed for blasphemy in the United Kingdom. Some appropriate way of remembering Aikenhead needs to be found today, perhaps a task for our anniversary year in 21. In the 18th century, we enter a new era. William Hamilton was a leading figure in the early Scottish Enlightenment, and he held the chair for almost 30 years. He was an exponent of what became known as moderate theology, with its greater stress on reason, ethics, and the improvement of society. His work struck a different note from that of his predecessors. Perhaps wary of ecclesiastical censure, he never published anything other than one sermon at the very end of his life. His Glasgow colleague John Simpson followed a similar pattern. He was arraigned for heresy on several occasions, but it was difficult to make the charges stick owing to the absence of any publications and his continuing to lecture in Latin. In the end, he was allowed to remain in post on full salary, but suspended from teaching. What a wonderful outcome. There is, however, one thing worth noting here. All of my predecessors understood their primary role in the university to be that of teachers. Some of them published very little, perhaps nothing at all. And when they did publish, often this was simply a transcript of earlier lectures. Their impact was directed towards their students and also to a wider public to whom they would lecture and preach. Rather than leaving a body of written work for posterity, their imprint was upon the lives of their hearers. Teaching, not research, was their primary calling as professors. By the mid-19th century, there were two major theological institutions in the city. The Divinity Faculty of the University, based at Old College, and here at New College, the institution of the Free Church, which came to pass after a major split in the Church of Scotland in 1843. The great Thomas Chalmers represents the parting of the ways. He held the University Chair of Divinity, but he resigned it at the disruption in 1843, and he became the first principal of New College in 1846. Only last week I came across a reminiscence of the great Chalmers as university professor. He lectured in what was then the Divinity Hall over at Old College. The young students packed the lecture theatre, and in the gallery sat members of the public, including many ex-army veterans who may have served at Waterloo. Chalmers began each lecture in earnest prayer. But on one occasion it was reported that as the hushed audience bowed their heads reverently, he was heard to grunt, "There's something wrong with these artificial teeth." Fortunately, Morningside dentistry has come a long way since then. It's often been said that New College, with some of its great figures in the late 19th century, outshone the Faculty of Divinity in the university. In some ways, that judgment is true. The biblical scholars of New College were at the forefront of their fields, and Hugh Ross Mackintosh was the leading Scottish theologian of the early 20th century. But one of the most distinguished scholars of the late Victorian period was Robert Flint, who held the chair of divinity from 1876 to 1903. His portrait hangs in the Senate room. Flint published on socialism and Darwinism, and he contributed important articles to the 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica. He was a good friend of the physicist P.G. Tate, and Flint proofread his books in order to check the mathematical equations. Not bad for a theologian. Into the 20th century, the chair was held for many years by W.P. Patterson, who did much to promote the eventual union of the Faculty of Divinity with New College. Just round the corner, you may have seen as you entered the hall this afternoon a painting depicting the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland in 1919. This was the first to be held after the war, and the assembly is being addressed in the painting by Field Marshal Haig. Presiding in the chair is Patterson, Professor of Divinity, who was appointed moderator of the General Assembly that year. It's a poignant scene, for Patterson and his wife had lost 2 of their sons in the war. He spent much of his moderatorial year dedicating war memorials around the country. But he was also a key player in the movement that brought about church reunion in 1929, and so the eventual union of the faculty with the college. This took place in 1935, here on the mound at New College, as one single institution represented both the university and the Church of Scotland. The building was refurbished. On the east side of the courtyard, the old high kirk of the Free Church was vacated and converted into what is now the New College Library. 3 stack rooms and 1 central reading room were constructed. 2 chairs of theology continued to be filled in the United Faculty. The old Free Church chair occupied by Mackintosh, and the long-established Divinity chair in the university, to which John Bailey was now appointed in 1934. The son of a Free Church minister in Gairloch in the West Highlands, Bailey had left Scotland to take up posts in North America. But he was persuaded to return to Scotland from New York. His wife only agreed to move on condition that their house in the Grange be fitted with central heating, a luxury she'd become accustomed to in New York. It was said that Bailey brought the sophistication of the New World to a rather stuffy ecclesiastical atmosphere. He had taught at Union Seminary, where Reinhold Niebuhr was his colleague and Dietrich Bonhoeffer was one of his students. He was a friend of T.S. Eliot, who often stayed at the Bailey's apartment in Manhattan. John Bailey was an accomplished philosophical theologian, but in the end his best-selling work proved to be his Diary of Private Prayer. Now translated into many languages, it has become the most popular production of any Scottish divine. Into the second half of the 20th century, the 2 leading theologians at New College were Tom Torrance and John McIntyre, both of whom were my teachers. Torrance attracted large numbers of overseas students to study for the PhD, perhaps an early sign of what was to come. McIntyre continued the philosophical interests that had marked the careers of early chair holders, but his time was punctuated by 2 spells acting as principal of the university, and a lengthy term as vice principal in which he presided over the construction of Pollock Halls in the 1960s, becoming its first warden. In 1979, James Mackey arrived to a chair of systematic theology to succeed Torrens, and he did so amidst some public controversy. He was the first Roman Catholic since the Reformation to hold a chair of theology in Scotland. An Irishman allegedly descended from a line of racehorse dealers and local politicians, he came from Waterford via San Francisco, and he relished bringing his own distinctive political style to life at New College. As Dean of the Faculty during the turbulent years of the 1980s, he rustled the Religious Studies Department from Glasgow and the Centre for the Study of Non-Western Christianity from Aberdeen. These proved shrewd acquisitions for New College, both developments doing much to shape the school in subsequent years. Mackey also ran an offshore account down at 121 George Street with Andrew Ross, and together they accumulated a very large six-figure sum for the Faculty of Divinity from lucrative pre-sessional teaching of Californian students who were billed privately. He became known as James Machiavelli. Mackey's books are not read much these days, but they repay serious study in my view, particularly his last work on creation and the future of religion. Torrens, MacIntyre and Mackey were all my teachers, and Mackey was also an early colleague. One thing they taught me was that you should never apologize in the university for being a faculty of divinity. Our subject has been taught since the beginning, and if we apply ourselves properly, we can match the highest standards of scholarship and academic rigor in the institution, not to mention the political acumen needed to defend one's patch. So much for the past. What then of the present? The long history of the Divinity Chair makes me realize that my own 20 years are but one brief episode. But I suspect in that space of time, the changes that have taken place are as rapid and far-reaching as at any period in the history of the university. Certainly when I consider New College from my own student days, the transformation now appears quite dramatic. For several centuries, the Faculty of Divinity had the primary purpose of training men for the ministry of the Church of Scotland. It functioned as both a seminary and university faculty. Lectures began and ended in prayer. Professors were Scottish clergymen who had served in parishes where they had written books and obtained doctorates. They continued to wear clerical garb in the lecture hall. By a later Act of Parliament, appointments were made to chairs by a large committee comprising 6 church representatives and 6 university representatives. This was the so-called 6 and 6, or as the Daily Record shamelessly branded the committee that had appointed James Mackey, the Dirty Dozen. Much of this has changed in the course of my own career. The undergraduate student body now has more women than men, something we could only dream of in the 1970s. Though we've not reached full parity, the academic staff body is now 37% female and is represented by 9 different nationalities. You'd never guess that I've been writing our Ref Environment statement over the summer, would you? The study of faiths other than Christianity and Judaism has also become a feature of New College life. Previously, it was assumed that you went to George Square to find out about other religions. The number of candidates training for ministry has declined sharply as a proportion of the student body. From close to 100%, candidate numbers now constitute less than 5% of the cohort. Professors are no longer appointed by a committee comprising equal numbers of church and university representatives. The legislation has simply been disregarded, both sides recognizing that it's anachronistic. These trends will continue and are unlikely to be reversed in any foreseeable future. Plurality and diversity are celebrated as intellectually enriching, socially inclusive, and reflective of our society and world. I welcome these for the stimulus and intellectual freedom that they have offered me in my own time. And though you might think that the emergence of more diverse trends, approaches, and viewpoints would create disunity, I have to say that the School of Divinity has been a more harmonious unit over the last 20 years than it was in my time as a student in the late 1970s and as a lecturer in the late 1980s. I'm grateful for that and consider myself fortunate to have served at this time. What then of Christian theology in this transformed setting and of a future for the chair of divinity? The question needs to be asked, not least because it is one that's frequently raised by critics of religion both inside and outside our universities. It's no longer sufficient to say that the university was founded for the teaching of theology or that it's always been around. The secularization of society raises new challenges that are not so easily deflected. And attempts to depict theology as the queen of the sciences, organizing and connecting all other forms of knowledge, will be met with some hostility, derision, or deconstruction. Lynn Marie Tonstad, a theologian at Yale, has even done this in a recent article this year. Why continue then with teaching and research in theology? One answer to that question is simple, if somewhat utilitarian. Christian theology will flourish in the university for as long as there are people who wish to study it. One of the paradoxical features of the Scottish divinity schools today is that there are more people studying theology in our country than ever before, even as churches empty and close all around us. There might be two explanations for this. The first is that although Christian affiliation is in rapid decline here in Scotland, especially amongst younger generations, it blossoms in other parts of the world, thus ensuring an international constituency, particularly within our graduate programs. As of this week, I'm supervising about 12 graduate students, but only one is from the UK. That tells its own story. A second explanation for student demand, particularly within our undergraduate programs, may be an intellectual curiosity that's no longer encumbered by expectations of conformity to ecclesiastical standards of orthodoxy. Although not entirely absent from university life, intellectual contempt and indifference are being replaced by puzzlement, surprise, and even some appreciation of religion. The questions it asks, the answers that it has given, its canonical texts, its societal influences, these are all of continuing interests to students today. This takes me into a more substantive kind of response. If theology is concerned with some of the most fundamental questions that face us, then would it not be surprising if it were excluded from academic life? Why is there something and not nothing? Why are we here? What is a human being? What wisdom can be gathered from our long-standing spiritual traditions and their classical texts? What makes a life worth living? Question that we've had to think about again in this time of lockdown. Simone Weil described herself as occupying a boundary between the church and the world. She wrote of the ways in which questions about ourselves, the world, God, suffering, and love are all intertwined. These do not admit of ready answers, but in pursuing them, we're drawn inevitably into theological territory. To suppress these questions or to refuse to entertain them in an academic context would only result in a narrowing of focus, even an ideological curtailment of free inquiry, though it would not be long before the same questions resurfaced in other disciplines. Theology alone cannot answer these questions. It must travel in conversation with other approaches, methods of inquiry, and their findings. That's why the juxtaposition of theology with biblical criticism, church history, and religious studies works rather well, despite inevitable tensions. I suspect that my predecessors would have assumed that. Indeed, they would have had difficulty recognizing the strict division of labor in today's academy. Should theology be a confessional enterprise? Yes, but not in a partisan or sectarian spirit. The judgments of theologians will reflect their own confessional commitments, though these must be open to challenge, correction, and adjustment. The history of the chair across 4 centuries suggests to us that theology is mobile. It is not mere repetition, clarification, or retrieval of what was accomplished in the 17th or the 20th century. The conversation with the past must continue, but it is a critical and a constructive one. Few of us today believe what was once taught here about predestination, hell, other religions, and the inerrancy of Scripture. Intellectual battles were fought over these issues. There is a constant return, certainly, through the canonical texts, but not in a spirit of slavish adherence. The study of divinity commits us ineluctably to normativity, we might say. There is no Archimedean point of neutrality. Every position, including atheism, skepticism, and naturalism, is freighted with normative judgments about God, spirituality, religion, the world, and human existence. Theology offers evaluative comments and ventures truth claims. If it could not do so, it would soon lose its significance and its interest for contemporary audiences. You might argue that we should confine ourselves to the history of Christian thought, but that again would represent some scarcely concealed normative judgments and bracket out some of the biggest questions that face us. It would be odd to include the study of Augustine, Aquinas, and Schleiermacher in the syllabus, while arguing in effect that if they applied for a job in one of our universities, we would not consider them appointable on account of the confessional claims that they make. In following Jesus, the Christian is committed to seeking the truth wherever it is to be found, to the Logos that is everywhere in the world. Here is Simone Weil again. One can never wrestle enough with God if one does so out of pure regard for the truth. Christ likes us to prefer truth to him, because being Christ, he is truth. If one turns aside from him to go towards the truth, one will not go far before falling into his arms. But here there's an obvious objection that will have already occurred to you. Why privilege the study of Christian theology in our university? The only sort of answer that can be given to that question is along the lines offered earlier. Theology has been around for 4 centuries, and its study has largely reflected the religious culture of Scotland. And if there is a continuing demand, then under the appropriate conditions, the case for the supply persists. But we should also recognize that the religious character of our host society has changed significantly. Other theologies are needed in our university. Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist views require to be represented. The voice of Christian theology will increasingly have to be heard in conversation with these other normativities. This is both a necessary and an exciting venture, which is likely to shape the future of the Chair of Divinity. Christian theology will be conducted in a multi-faith context and not in monofaith isolation. A further reason, and here I risk raising some hackles, is that the study of theology is a necessarily cohesive element in any school of divinity. What is it that prevents our different disciplines from shearing off in disparate directions, whether to classics, history, philosophy, literature, or the social sciences? Each of us could find a location there, and indeed we already have valued conversation partners in these other fields of study. So what is it that holds us together? Might it be a shared commitment to offering some insight into the religious self-understanding of human beings and of the world in which we are situated? This is at root a theological enterprise in its broadest sense. It does not require a consensus in favor of any creed or worldview. Indeed, it's more invigorating and stimulating if these are contested. But it does entail a commitment to pursuing some normative questions of perennial importance in the time and place in which we find ourselves. And what might theology offer the wider university? It's a question always worth asking, especially given the dangers of intellectual isolation here on the Mound. If we're not connected with other parts of the university, then our position becomes precarious. And writing the ref statement, I've been impressed by how many of my colleagues are engaging with scholars in other parts of the university, in the sciences, in Islamic studies, in literature, in Asian studies, and of course with classics, history, and philosophy. We bring something to these conversations, and I believe that the future of my own chair will require a capacity to work not only with the theologies of other faith traditions, but also with some of our partner disciplines in the university. And I would urge graduate students today not to become too narrow in your intellectual interests or in neglecting to find out what is happening beyond your own field. Don't stay at home because someone's reading a paper at the research seminar which doesn't look relevant to your own field of study. Theology may also have a public role to play within the wider strategic aims of the university. Let me offer just two brief examples. There is a tacit assumption that theology exists in a positive relationship to the ideals of a democratic society. That, of course, has not always been the case, and it may be under some strain in our own day. But this commitment to democratic society is worth defending amidst rising tides of populism and erosion of institutions that provide the necessary checks and balances for the functioning of a well-regulated democracy. The contribution of faith communities to the health of our fragile democracies will continue to be important. They need to be brought on side if the values of political liberalism are indeed close to the heart of the university. And to do so, given its close links with faith bodies, it's desirable that theology should be located within and not outside the academic community. Democracy is one example. Another is the pressing challenge of global sustainability. The recently published Living Planet report of the WWF states this: a deep cultural and systemic shift is urgently needed, one that so far our civilization has failed to embrace, a transition to a society and economic system that values nature. If we're to make such a deep cultural shift, then the world religions will have to play an important role, working amongst themselves and with other agencies to articulate a strong sense of our connectedness to the natural world, to other creatures, and to future generations. The capacity of religion to give normative expression to the importance of our descendants, our embeddedness in the natural world, and our temporary stewardship of this planet is well attested. If sustainability is a strategic aim of the university, then it will need to engage with religion and theology along the way. These reflections are offered in response to a possible secular critic. And somehow, since my time as an art student in the 1970s, I've always assumed that these would be the most familiar and formidable challenges to be faced as a theologian in the university. But now I detect a threat from elsewhere, namely the church. Anxiety about traditional models of theological education is acutely felt today, as candidates must now train for different forms of ministry in a society that has largely seceded from its earlier Christian affiliation. Instead of maintaining an already Christianized society, the churches face a tougher challenge of missional engagement, of service and outreach within a rapidly changing context, marked by indifference, loss of institutional attachments, unfamiliarity with the rituals, practices, and beliefs of Christian faith. Might an apprentice model of ministry work better, in which candidates are rooted in parishes working alongside other ministers and gaining their theological education through day release or distance learning modes? Might this give them greater resilience and a spiritual formation that's difficult to provide in a university setting? I don't doubt the need for significant revisions to our forms of training, but there are some compelling reasons for maintaining a system that has functioned since 1583, and in the case of the three other ancient Scottish universities, since the late Middle Ages. The first, to put it crudely, is financial. The churches get a good deal in Scotland, given that graduate candidates are not required to pay tuition fees. This applies to the Church of Scotland and to any other tradition that wishes to take advantage of the same arrangement. And I see no reason why in the future the provision might not be similarly extended to other faiths, as happens, for example, in the Free University in Amsterdam. Beyond that, there is an advantage in being exposed to current teaching and research in the theological disciplines and in mixing with students from a wide variety of backgrounds. For the university can be seen as a microcosm of our wider society, which is the context in which ministry is to be exercised. And the church itself can be enriched by exposure to scholarly excellence in the study of religion. At least that's a view that's been held in Edinburgh for 4 centuries. I recently took part in a review of the Church of Ireland College in Dublin, and I was struck by the Archbishop who came along to the university at Trinity College Dublin. He was asked for his views of the provision. He said, "I don't like writing a cheque to the university for €100,000 every year, but I'm unwilling to tolerate a situation in which my clergy are preaching to congregations who are better educated than they are. Withdrawing candidates from the university will remove them from an important part of our cultural mainstream, and the advantages of studying in a context enriched by multiplicity of approaches to the subject of religion. The university, for its own part, is increasingly concerned to promote its link with professional bodies and other public agencies. We should expand rather than contract our relationship with professional bodies in the future, reaching out to school teachers, to other faith groups, and to third sector organizations. Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi, has written about the importance of people of faith being saved from believing too much in the wrong things. The critical study of theology in the university can be an important part of that process. In the future, the School of Divinity will not be sustained by the number of church candidates. There will be no return to the status quo ante. But there should remain a place for professional training, for public outreach, and not just to the churches. For this is one that will connect faith groups, society, and our university in ways that will be beneficial to all of these. I hope that I shall live to see a 25th holder of the Chair of Divinity. It's unlikely that the long run of Scottish clergymen can or even should continue, but that won't be my call. Whoever he or she is, they will encounter as much vitality, excitement, and innovation as at any time in our history. That's worth celebrating, even amidst these extraordinary circumstances today. I finished writing this lecture on Monday evening and turned to John Bailey's Diary of Private Prayer. There I found a prayer that seemed strangely relevant for the occasion. These offer us some wisdom at the start of an academic year. Give me an open mind, he says, a mind ready to receive and to welcome new light of knowledge. Give me courage to change my mind when that is needed. Let me be tolerant to the thoughts of others and hospitable to such light as may come to me through them. Good thoughts to take with us in a spirit of intellectual humility into the start of another exciting session. And I wish you every success along the way. And I thank you for being present here this afternoon.
Thank you, David, for a wonderful lecture, a characteristic model of brevity, lucidity, and wit. You've taken us from the prayer book riots and the tragic hanging of Aikenhead, which I have to say I knew nothing about, to the union of New College with the Faculty of Divinity and Mackie's offshore accounts, which I'll be sure to have a little look at in the weeks ahead. More importantly, you've shown us why we still need not just a Professor of Divinity, but why the school itself is so important, not just within the wider town, but also within the wider university itself. And so thank you very much. And again, thank you to all of you for coming.